The prisoners, including the boy with the red-brown hat, through the doors of the prison and closed them with a loud metal clang. Chapter 34, Fight from Chains by Laurie Halse Anderson. Sunday, November 17th to Sunday, November 24th, 1776. I had no time to ponder Curzon's fate. Madame commanded that a supper be thrown to celebrate the capture of Fort Washington, complete with turtle soup. The house fair exploded with dust and activity. The junior officers cleared out their cots, clothing, and maps from the second-floor drawing room so we could scrub and polish it from ceiling to floor. The kitchen hearth was crowded with irons heating to press the tablecloths and serviettes. Madame hired the cook from the city tavern to prepare the meal. Folks said he had a way with turtles. She then chose the prettiest of the soldier wives to wait the tables. The ugly ones and Sarah, with her big belly, were to stay in the kitchen to assist the cook and wash up. My job was to ferry the food up the stairs and the dirty crockery down. The food began arriving long before sunup, packed into the crates and hauled by sleepy-eyed boys. 3 turtles, each the size of a footstool, came in a wooden pen. The sound of their flippers scratching made Sarah yelp in fright. 2 of the turtles kept their heads tight against their shells. The third stretched out his neck and watched the commotion with the wet, solemn eyes. While we scurried to finish the house and the cook butchered the turtles and plucked the pheasants, the hairdresser arrived to tend to Madame. He spent hours applying pomatum wax, patting the lengths of brick-colored hair to fashion a high roll on Madame's head. The hair swept off her brow and soared into the air like a wave curling before a ship's prow. I thought that the wave might crumble, but Madame didn't ask my opinion. She wanted a pot of hot chocolate made with 2 handfuls of sugar, which is kind of a shocking amount. Sarah and the cook were exchanging heated words in the kitchen. Empty turtle shells stood drying in the corner, and the cook's assistant stirred the thick pot bubbling over the fire. I grabbed the chocolate pot and I left, not wanting to see what became of the poor creatures' heads. As I served the hot chocolate and tidied the chamber, Madame rubbed her face with Venetian Bloom Water Beauty Wash to remove the wrinkles. After that came a layer of Molyneux Italian's paste to make her skin white as bleached linen. It made her resemble a corpse. And then the final triumph. She used a tiny brush to paint a thin line of blue above each eye. Madame opened an envelope and shook out 2 gray strips of mouse fur, each cut into an arc. Leaning towards the mirror, she glued the mouse fur onto her one eyebrow, making them bushy and thick as the fashion required. In truth, she looked like a woman with 2 lumps of mouse fur stuck on her face. A delicate bell sounded overhead and Lady Seymour summoning help. The guests will be arriving soon, Madame said, admiring her reflection. Aunt Seymour wishes to be seated in advance of them. You may assist her. After I helped the lady limp from her chamber to her place near the end of the long table, I placed a foot warmer filled with hot coals under her chair and spread a woolen blanket over her lap. She thanked me kindly and looked about. When I was young, we dined like this every night, she said with a sigh. I could scarce credit it. The table was covered by the finest linen tablecloths I'd ever seen. Each place had china plates, crystal glasses, and ivory-handled knives and forks. Candles were positioned every 3 hands. Salt cellars, each with a tiny spoon, and pepper mills were set in easy arm's reach of each place. Smaller tables and sideboards were positioned at the edge of the room to hold trays and dishes. One table was covered with wine bottles. Candlelight reflected back and again on the polished mirrors that hung from the walls. I caught a glimpse in the hearth mirror of a girl with a mark on her cheek that trumpeted her shame. I quickly turned my eyes away. There was a heavy knock at the door. It begins, Lady Seymour said. Go below, child. I set the tray loaded with the turtle soup bowls on the table by the door. 3 more trays needed to be brought up to the stairs, but I allowed myself a quick peek at the company before I fetched them. The table was crowded with officers wearing splendid uniforms and perfectly powdered wigs, along with several of Master Lockton's business companions. Lockton wore a cardinal red satin waistcoat, black satin coat and breeches, and shoes with silver buckles. The new clothes could not hide the fact that the master was grinding himself down with work. Long hours serving the British commandment had melted off the fat from his second and third chins and created heavy black circles under his eyes. But his bags of gold grew fatter, and that was what he cared for most. Madame reigned over her end of the table with the occasional flutter of her fan, and the wave of a hair above her brow threatened to crash at any moment. Lady Seymour, only other woman present, looked like an elegant spider wrapped in a black lace shawl. Her eyes were lively in the candlelight, and her cheeks had color for the first time in weeks. The officer next to her was the size and shape of Edward, the shaggy bull who lived down the road from us in Rhode Island. The man did not have a ring in his nose, but he laughed with an impatient, snorting sound. I hurried up and down the stairs with the remaining trays of soup, then the roasted tongue and mushrooms. The serving girl cut the meat on Lady Seymour's plate before setting it down so that the weakness of her arm would not hinder her. The young soldier who was appointed wine steward danced around the backs of the guests, keeping their glasses full. The conversating flowed as fast as the wine, the talking of Fort Washington, news from London, plans for a fox hunt, and in this last, an officer joked that the next fox would be a tall sort from Virginia by the name of George Washington. That caused a hearty laughter all around. The glasses were raised. A serving girl hissed at me to go back to the kitchen. When I entered the room a half hour later, my arms shook under the weight of the tray. The cook had prepared enough to feed a battalion. Pheasant stuffed with figs, stewed oysters, potted larks, greens cooked with bacon, pickled watermelon rind, and buttered parsnips. The pheasant smelled good, and I hoped that some might find its way into the scrap bucket. By the time I had lugged the dessert tray, rice pudding, lemon biscuits, 2 creamed pear tarts, and an iced cake, the fire was blazing and the room was much warmer. And the 2 of the officers had loosened their lace neckcloths. The heat had softened the glue of Madame's left mousy eyebrow, and it had begun to free itself from her face, but she didn't notice this. The serving girls and the wine steward watched the progress of the eyebrow and fought to keep smiles from their faces. The voices of the men were loud and booming, as if the wine they drank affected their hearing. I handed a plate of tarts to one of the serving women, who carried it to the table and set it in front of Colonel Hawkins. "So, how many rebel prisoners did your men bag, Colonel?" said Master Lockton. I passed another dish of tarts. "Near 3,000 of the devils. We wish we could have shot 'em all." My hands shook as I reached for the third. "Why so?" Lockton said. "We've no place to put them." The colonel pushed the tart to the side and reached to the bowl of shelled almonds in the middle of the table. He tossed a few in his mouth and crunched loudly. "I thought you were using Bridewell." "That should provide ample space," said Lockton. The colonel snorted and shook his head. "The prison is so stuffed, the walls are ready to burst. We've had to pack them into sugar houses and confiscated churches, too." He reached for more nuts. "It's a right nuisance. Never thought we'd have so many." "I'd say so many prisoners are a badge of honor for your men and the king," Lockton said. The colonel raised an eyebrow. "We don't need a badge of honor. We need a decent plague to take them off our hands." The men at the table chuckled. "The expense of feeding them is going to be staggering." The rebels planted the seeds of war. Let them enjoy their harvest. Lockton ate a forkful of tart. Force the local patriots to feed them. "I say shoot 'em," growled the man who looked like Edward the Bull. "Of course, then we'd have to dispose of the bodies. That's messy work, you know." "Waste of ammunition," said the colonel, "and some members of Parliament would fuss like wet hens. Nah, I predict a cold winter will dispatch them with the natural ways." Lady Seymour spoke up. "What if the rebels decide that turnabout is fair play? We need to care for them so they do not harm our British captives." "With all due respect, ma'am," the man said with a smile, "the rebels would first have to capture a prisoner. Given their blunders, it's a really unlikely prospect." Lady Seymour nodded gravely. "But what if the prisoners they took after their victory at Breed's Hill?" The table fell still at that. Talk of what happened at Breed's Hill in Boston was as rude as stating that Madame's false eyebrow was about to fall off. The Lady Seymour was the wealthy, elderly widow of a British lord, incapable of social error, so all pretended that she hadn't said a word. Several men cleared their throats and reached for their wine. Madame lifted her goblet. "I'm told there are plans to reopen the John Street Theater. This heralds a return to civilization and order." Her eyebrows flopped into the rice pudding. The man, seated to the right of her, coughed loudly into his napkin. The wine steward's face turned the color of a plum, and a serving girl bit down on her lip to prevent laughter. Madame avoided looking at her pudding. "A toast," she said, with the serving wobbling wine. "A toast to civilization," Lockton added. "I've heard plans for a cricket club, too." As the men roared in approval, I carried the tray loaded with the dirty supper dishes down the stairs. On my return trip upstairs, I carried 2 pots of coffee. My trips up and down the stairs continued until my knees threatened to fold up and quit, bringing dishes down, carrying more delicacies and hot drinks, down, up, 100 miles of stairs that night. As the candles guttered out and were replaced with new ones, Madame and Lady Seymour returned to their bedchambers, and Lockton's business companions left to play billiards at the King's Head Tavern. The officers requested more coffee, lit their pipes, and unrolled their maps across the tablecloths, stained now with splashes of turtle soup, butter, wine, and candle wax. The serving girls moved down to the kitchen where the kettles of water were put on a boil for the washing of the dishes. The cook was long departed, and Sarah dozed on the kitchen chair, her swollen feet propped up on a pillow. I picked up the enormous bowl of table scraps and headed out the back door. Miss Mary Finch always mixed table scraps with muck and spread the smelly mess on her garden come spring. But the Locktons weren't much for growing things, and not when the markets were so close at hand. Scraps here, they were just dumped down the privy. I closed the door behind me and stopped. The cold air took my breath away. The sky was a black curtain, the stars ice chips whittled by an old knife. I wrapped the shawl tighter across my shoulders and I pulled it high to protect my neck. And through the kitchen window, I could see the 2 of the women squabbling about who was going to wash and who was going to dry. The second floor windows glowed with candlelight, shadowed by the shapes of the officers circling the maps. I shuddered and my teeth banged together. Water would turn solid tonight. It was a bad night to be without a blanket. Would they truly allow prisoners to freeze to death? The soldier wives stopped arguing and the men lit fresh candles. The stars wheeled above me inside, deep inside, and something turned. I couldn't name it or recognize its form. I drew in a cold breath and blew it skyward. The air came out of me in the shape of a cloud, and it drifted above the rooftop and dissolved into the stars. Were they going to let him starve? The stars said not a word. The back door banged until I jumped. "Don't tarry," said Sarah. "You need to dry the last of them glasses before you go to sleep." "Yes, ma'am, as soon as I finish this." I quickly carried the scrap bowl out into the yard, walking past the privy all the way back to the stables wall where straggly holly bush grew. I glanced quick at the house to make sure no one was watching. I pulled aside the prickly branches on the bush and I set the bowl down within it. I covered the bowl with my apron, and on my way back to the house, I loaded my arms with firewood. I doubted they'd notice that I left the bowl outside, not with me bringing in wood. I took another deep breath of the frozen air before I opened the door, and confused that I should be awake after such a long day. I frowned as my thoughts tumbled and multiplied. I'd been invaded. A dim plan had hatched itself in my brain pan without my consent, but I didn't much like it. And that's the end of the chapter.